What's up, YouTube Nation? I'm the Coffee Bean GM. Today we're going to talk a little bit about horror in your fantasy, or even, just in your role-playing games in general. As long as you don't mind my rambling a little bit, because this is something that's been shaking around in my head a little bit, and I'm not sure how exactly I want to tackle this, I suppose you could say. But, one of the things is it's really, really hard to kind of grasp that horror feeling in an RPG game. When you think about horror, you generally go with things like movies and books. But you see, movies, they're almost on a different level because when you watch a movie, um, it's enticing both your visual and your audio senses. Now, so when they have a jump scare or something of that sort, it's flashing onto your screen and it's basically overwhelming your senses. That's what's causing you to jump and to freak out for that moment. When you watch movies that are much more creepy or gross, I guess you could say, something like The Human Centipede, for those of you who've seen that, that's hitting you more at a carnal level almost. And you could hear about somebody telling you about this, and it'll be like, yeah, that's pretty nasty, but it doesn't affect you the same way that visually seeing this on a TV does, and visually, watching this or hearing it as it goes on. And that's something that's really difficult to capture in a role-playing tabletop-based game. You can certainly do creepy stuff. You can describe things very eerily, humanizing things and stuff like that. And you can also, gross out your players. When they walk into a room, you can tell them about how they see this body, this mangled body on the ground. Its genitals have been ripped apart and it's choked itself on its own intestines. Yeah, that gives you a pretty visceral image, and you can see that in your mind's eye. But that's completely different than seeing that on something like a TV screen when this is happening, right? Because I'm not sure why, really. I mean, I suppose you could kind of look into the study of it or something, but it's on a different level when you can truly actually see this happening on the TV screen or in something compared to when it's being described to you. Because I think your mind itself and your mind's eye, when people are describing things, tones things down a little bit. You can see what happening in your head. It works the same way with books, right? When you read a book, you can read some books that are very horror-based and gross. I don't read a whole lot of horror. Stephen King does things that are more on a psychic, or I guess disturbing or creepy sort of level. Sort of scary, not so much the gore, but there's what's his name? Brian Ludlum, I think it is. He has some stuff that's pretty gory. I know there's plenty of horror authors out there that take a more gore approach, and even those books, it works the same way. You might be a little bit creeped out when you watch it or you read it. I'm sorry, but it doesn't really scare you. If you sit down here in the middle of the night and it's dark out and you're reading a creepy ghost story, that gets a little bit creepy and that can kind of get your blood running a little bit and creeped out. But most of the time that is because you're here by yourself and you're sitting down by yourself and you're reading something that's very creepy and scary and you're sitting in the dark. I mean, you're basically creeping yourself out. And it's no different than if you were sitting in a hotel room or something in the middle of the night and everything is dark, and the place has rumors of being haunted. You're going to creep yourself out just by running these things over in your head and thinking about it. When you sit down at a table and you have a group of friends around you and you're trying to do something scary or something horror-based, it is very difficult. Not only because you got everybody who's around you already, but because, you guys are munching on Cheetos and you're leaving cheesy fingerprints on your papers and you're shuffling through books. And when you sit down to play a tabletop game, it's a social thing and it's entertaining, it's fun. And even if you go into something knowing that you're going to be running a horror game or something that's horror-based, it's still a social gathering and everybody's there to have fun. As the GM is like describing things to you and telling you about what you see and what you hear, when you have other people around you who are doing things and talking, it's just not scary. You can do a few things. One of the popular things people say if you browse around on the internet is to play some creepy music in the background. You can, but it ain't going to do anything. You could turn the lights down, maybe set some candles in the center of the table. Again, probably ain't going to do anything. It's gimmicky. It's very cliche. When people see those things, it's almost going to be comedic, I guess. It's not going to be taken seriously. You can even tell your players to come in to this game expecting to be scared and to come in with that mindset and to help craft the story and to creep everybody out, be scared. And it can work to a degree, but again, it's very, very difficult. And falling into these gimmicky cliche of dimming the lights and candles and creepy music and dressing up with a hood or something, it's just more comedic than anything. It's not going to help out the horror game at all. But there are a few things you can do. Now, the first thing, if you're going to be running a horror game, you need to find a system that complements the horror. By that I mean the system rules, the rules that your game is running off of, somehow have to incorporate horror, or they have to give you something as a GM to work with to scare their players. So how do you scare players? Well, you don't really scare them with the horror-based thing. When it really comes down to it, you don't scare the players. I mean, it's almost impossible. You don't have that jump scare effect. You could jump up and slam on the table in a really quiet moment, and you might get a few startles out of them for sure. But then everybody's going to chuckle and laugh, and it's going to move on, and it didn't do a whole lot. I guess I go on a little digression here, but I think a part of it is because when you're running a role-playing game, everybody is there to tell a story with each other. Everybody's building off of one another, and they have control of their characters. They know what their characters are doing. They know what to expect, and they know how their characters are going to react. When you're watching a movie, you don't have that effect. What you're watching is what's happening, and as a person, you have absolutely no control over what's going to happen in that movie. The most you can do is turn it off. You can't tell. You can yell at the screen and tell them to do something else. Like the stupid bimbos that might be going out into the darkness, wearing nothing but their panties and with a flashlight in the middle of Friday the 13th or something, because they're stupid. You can yell at them, but again, it's just cheesy. And you have no control over that character. So when a monster jumps out, or there's a loud, obnoxious sound as something like a door slams, it's an overwhelming of your senses, and that is what's scaring you. Now, there are movies that take a more creepy thing, and they work just like your ghost stories. And when you're reading a book, they're scary and they're creepy because it gets your mind racing. And most of the time when you're doing those, you're in a darker room in the theater, or maybe you're by yourself, or even if you have a couple people, you get ingrained in what's going on there. When you're reading a book, it's a little more different, and it's a little bit harder to get scared by a book. When you're sitting around the tabletop, it's very difficult. One exception that's really interesting is video games. There's some really creepy, scary video games out there. And it's weird because in those video games, you have control of your character. You can go where you want and do what you want, in most games anyway. And yet they still scare you. Some of the Silent Hills or Resident Evils have some really great moments that, just makes you jump. But again, I think a lot of it is because it overwhelms your senses, both visual and audio. Like the loud screaming of some zombie like a monster in Resident Evil, like crashing down the hallway at you. It's usually loud. And the visual is overwhelming as well. You got bright colors, things are flashing, lights are flashing, and you got this huge talking thing coming at you. In Silent Hill, it might be the sound of the Pyramid Head, dragging his weapon across the floor, and that scrapey sort of sound. And, it's strange. It's really hard to capture that in an RPG game. So, before I go on rambling anymore, there are a few things, as I said, that you can do. So, to get back on topic here after my little spew, first thing you want to do is find a game that complements horror. Something like Call of Cthulhu is very horror-based. My Shadow of the Demon Lord, which you've probably seen a ton on my website, is another one. Those games, they capture the horror because that is the setting. Something like D&D is a little bit more difficult, although they've made some pretty good strides. The Curse of Strahd supplement, I had a chance to flip through that a couple days ago, and they did a really good job. Um, and you can definitely tweak the rules a little in D&D to capture that horror feel. Something like Mutants and Masterminds. Yeah, it's not horror, and it's really hard to get anything in there that would be horror-based. Or Die 6 Fantasy, or basic role-playing, The One Ring. The games like these, they really have nothing that complements horror. Some other good horror ones might be Lamentations of the Flame Princess. That has some really good horror stuff in there. But those games, the horror-based games, within the rules, they have ways to complement horror. Being that is what they're going for, that is the setting that they're building, that's what they want the GMs in the game should focus on. So they give you the tools to do that. We're going to use Shadow of the Demon Lord as an example since I got the books here, and I know more about that than I do a lot of the other ones. Call of Cthulhu is another good one. But one of the things I use is insanity. So your character has health or hit points or whatever you want to call it, and when they drop down to 0, they're dead. Insanity kind of works the same way, depending on the system. In Shadow of the Demon Lord, you build up insanity. If your sanity hits your will score, then your character is going to start going crazy. You get marks of madness, and it starts getting twisted around. And you can use those to start invoking a little bit of horror, because what it goes back to is, even though you can't scare the players on a horror or scary level, you can scare them by using their character against them or somehow manipulating that. See, players are attached to their characters, so you want them to get in character. You want them to basically build a love for their character and then just rip that away from them. I know that sounds horrible, and as a GM, I'm one of the people who I really don't like killing player characters, because I get so invested in the story and I start crafting the story around the players and offering them their own scenes and their own storylines that when you kill them, all that work almost seems moot. I really enjoy being able to see a character go through their story and go through their progressions and see what happens to them. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to kill them. I let the dice roll how they roll, and while I feel bad a lot of the times, it is what it is, and 99% of the time the players, they'll be a little salty at first, but after they kind of get a chance to relax and think about it, they had a hell of a time with that character, they enjoyed it, and it's time for something new. So things you can do, well, I'm going to use Shadow of the Demon Lord as a basis just because, again, I have the books right here, but use the tools that they give you. In the next game, they give you insanity. While you can definitely start killing these characters in health and draining their health, and that's going to obviously get the player worked up a little bit and scared when they're starting to get down to the minimum. You want to use that insanity against them. You want their character to start building insanity, because in this game, insanity, the more insanity you get, the harder it is to do things. When you get into a battle or something, you're forced to go last in the initiative. Your character, depending on how much insanity they have or the quirks that they have, they might be stunned, they might be paralyzed in fear, and it's taking away the player's chance to do things. You're limiting them, which really starts to freak them out. When they know that this huge beast is coming at them, and their character cannot do anything, they're stuck relying on the others, and that can be a scary thing. Another thing in Shadow Demon Lord is corruption. I know some other games have this too, and it's kind of ways that the character or the player can do things to gain corruption. That's kind of on them, but once they get it, it just starts to deteriorate them and demonize them, I guess. Strange things starts happening that they don't have control over, and they start losing control of that character. And again, that's where scare and fear comes in, just like when you're watching a movie. You have no control over what's happening to those people in that movie or in that TV show, and that's something that can kind of scare you, because you have no idea what to expect. You can't do anything about it. And that's the same thing with these games that somehow bring horror into it, and you start using that and these tools like insanity and corruption, you're taking away the player's chance to do things. Okay, and that is a big part of horror things. Another thing you can do is things like massive damage, and make it worthwhile. So if a player has 30 health and they take 20 health and damage, don't describe that as, they got an arrow in the shoulder that they kind of snapped off and broke or whatever. No, describe that or do something so that they realize they just took a massive amount of damage. Knock them out. Throw them to the ground. They're prone. A lot of games, D&D has rules for massive damage, and lingering injuries is the other one. Make these things worthwhile. Don't make it just a simple, he hit you with a sword or he clubbed you across the head with his club. No, make that worthwhile. Take away some of these abilities or some of these opportunities the players had. If they come along and they get slammed by half a tree trunk sized club by some giant, they ain't just going to stumble back a few and then jump right into the fray. No, they're going to go flying 20, 30 feet, hit the ground, maybe their sword goes flying off into the distance, their shield breaks or something, or they hit their head on a rock and they're unconscious for a round or two. Use these things within the narrative, and especially for when they take a massive amount of damage or lingering damages, to somehow take that character and use it against the player, I suppose you could say, or take away opportunities that character has. If he's laying there and he's like, oh shit, what am I going to do? Maybe he's unconscious for a couple of rounds. All those other players are going to have to pick up the slack, and he'll get more invested. It will piss some players off, don't get me wrong. But those are the type of players who, in my opinion, they are not there to have a good time and tell a story then. They're there to kill things and min-max and whatever you want to call it. That's the completely different argument that I don't want to get into. But for me personally, those are the type of players I really don't have any interest in. If they're going to bitch and complain because they got hit by this massive giant and their character fell unconscious for a round or two, then piss off as far as I'm concerned. We're here to build a story. It's much more heroic when he was able to pull himself up and gather his sword and run back into there and land the killing blow on this beast. And that's what I expect of my players. But, and when they use those tools to enhance your story, use those tools to put a little bit of fear into the players in regards to their character. Because now, with their character unconscious on the ground, taking massive amounts of damage and bleeding out as their mind is just going nuts with all this insanity that's going on around them, that'll start to freak the player out, because now they're down to the nitty-gritty. They have to do something in order for this character to survive. And that's the other thing, is you want them to get connected with their character. Give them 2 or 3 sessions to get in their character, get playing them, really get a feel for them. And that's when you go for the strike and you start, just tearing things apart on them. That'll start to freak them out a little bit. One thing else you want to do when running a horror game is to let all the players know what to expect. Be sure to tell them, hey, this isn't a comedy game. This isn't some sort of chuckle fuckery that, I want everybody goofing off and throwing Cheetos at one another during the scenes and stuff. Tell the players what to expect. If they come in and they know what to expect and that this is going to be a more horror and darker, grim game, then 99% of the players will come in with that expectation. It's almost impossible to run a game without some laughter and jokes and things like that, because that's a whole part of the social gaming. Everybody's there to have a good time, and let's face it, you're not there to hear about some nasty, creepy, disgusting gore fest of a story. I mean, maybe that's something that people are into, and I won't lie, I enjoy some of that stuff with myself. But I like a little bit of humor in there. I like that that release of laughter and that comedic thing is kind of just a release of the tension, and it's almost impossible to ignore. If you go back and watch some of my other Shadow the Demon Lord games, I try to invoke some fear and horror and creepiness and gore, but there's still a lot of laughter. Everybody's having a good time, and really, when it comes down to it, that's what you want. You want everybody to laugh and to have a good time. If they're laughing and smiling, then they're having a great time, and you're doing a great job. I mean, that's your goal. Let's see what else we got here. When you describe things, give it a sense of either strangeness or unpredictability, or personify things. When you talk about the water that's out in the distance, talk about how it is heaving and sighing. Give it that personification, like it's alive. Strange things, you might talk about all these spiders that are crawling out of a hole, but they all have 7 legs or 13 legs, something really strange that just doesn't quite make sense. There's a great example in the Demon Lord book. It's actually from a movie. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. But you have a guy who comes into a place and he's talking with this old lady behind the counter of like an inn or bar or something. And, it's like this little sweet old lady that you just fall in love with, and she's through the movie here and there, and she's talking. It's somebody who's like really trying to help this guy, but finally it kind of pans around to the back side, and you can see that there's this old man chained underneath the desk, and he's been chained there, and he's all like desiccated and nasty, and it's because he's this nice little old lady's basically enslaved him and torturing him, and it really creeps the players out when you can kind of do something like that. Get them invested with an NPC, that they really like, that is somehow helping them out and doing these things, and then give us some really strange twist. I can't think of any that I've done off the top of my head recently, but I know there is another one in the book that caught my eye, and it was the idea of, maybe the priest of this town is helping him out, and maybe he's like the priest of your group's mentor or something like that. And as they kind of go on in the story, they later find out that he had a wife at one time, but she passed away. And maybe a little bit further on down the story, they're doing something at the church, and they kind of head down the basement, and they find the wife's body. She's now a ghoul, and the priest is like dragging in somebody and throwing her into this pit with her, where she's eating and tearing apart this person. So this priest that everybody idolized and is like this great holy man, is a mentor to one of your PCs, has been kidnapping the kids around town and feeding him to his ghoul wife. That's something that is just, they'll just blow their mind if you do something like that to them. And that's a really cool idea. It takes some time as a GM to sit down and think about some really cool twists, but get the players invested in an NPC, get them to like somebody, a mentor, a teacher, a good help, somebody who helps them out a lot, just a close friend, and give it some really strange, unpredictable, sort of creepy twist, and that'll go a long way. I think that's, those kind of touch on the main parts that I try to do. You can always do gore. Gore isn't hard to do and describe things in a very gory atmosphere. Oddly, nudity will go a long way to getting players kind of amped up. It's strange, but it works. There are some things you don't want to do with the taboo. Make sure that when you get in with your players and stuff, you don't touch on things that really affect them. Especially things with like kids, some people can get really turned off by that and upset. So, let your players know this is going to be a darker, grim game, and get them to make sure that you don't hit any trigger points that really sets them off. Because that'll just, it'll ruin the whole session for you. And that's really about it. So, kind of a little recap before I head out here, but, a few things that you can do. You can use the tools that the game gives you, your insanity and your corruption, lingering damage, massive damage. And to go with those, for the second thing, take away the player's opportunities to use their character's abilities. Limit them in what they can do and how things are going. There are players who might get a little upset about that, but if they're good story players, if they're good players that really enjoy telling the story and they're not worried about just tearing everything up, 99 of them will, really enjoy that kind of thing. So just limit them, and they'll just be like, oh, fuck, what am I going to do now? And that'll start getting their blood pumping a little bit. Describe things in unnatural, strange, weird ways, like the water heaving and sighing. And on top of that, throw in some really strange twists and really twisted sort of twists. Another good example for one of the games that I did is called The Hanging Bodies of Echo Hill, another Shadow of the Demon Lord game. And basically, we had the story, these players went into this town and they're trying to find out who was killing all these guys and hanging them from this old bridge. They were chopping off their genitalia, and they would just leave these bodies hanging on the bridge dead. As the players kind of started searching through and talking to these different people to find out what happened, it ended up getting linked back to a few different people, and the little old lady that they were talking to, they had a suspicion the whole time about the story, but, she had some strange things that were going on about her, and as the story kind of progressed, I don't want to give away any spoilers, hopefully you wouldn't mind watching it or something, but in the end of it, it ended up being this demon-type creature, or a vengeance demon, who was summoned in to help accidentally, I guess, just by these people's prayers and asking for help, and he kind of come in and he started taking care of things, but in a very vicious and twisted sort of way. And there's quite a few twists I threw into the story, and it ended up kind of the players really got into that and they enjoyed that because of those twists. So those are the main ones. When you're playing at home on a tabletop or something, you can certainly dim the lights a little bit. I mean, that does help, I guess, a little bit. Maybe a little bit of soft music in the background. For me, I don't think they do anything. I mean, that's just me. But if your players are into it, then by all means, go for it. I think that's about it. It's things like making things creepy and gory is certainly a big part of it. Personifying things and just using the tools that those games give you. Be sure to check out like the running the game sections of things like the Call of Cthulhu handbooks and the Demon Lord handbooks. Curse of Strahd, the new D&D 5e supplement, has some really good sections in there about how to scare your players, and they even give you little examples you can read. I think they touch on personifying things too. I remember reading something the other day about describing a chest as a squatting chest, and you're giving it that personification that's squatting down. So, that's what I got for you guys today. Think about that. How do you guys invoke some fear into your players? How do you scare them? What has worked or hasn't worked for you? And, I'd love to hear it. So comment below and have a great day, guys.